The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Riverside County Superior Court, casting long shadows across the polished marble floor as 3-year-old Emma Rodriguez was carefully lifted into the witness chair. Her tiny legs, clad in white tights and small black shoes, dangled helplessly from the adult-sized seat that seemed to swallow her whole. A chair had been designed for grown-ups, not for a child who still needed help reaching the bathroom sink or tying her shoelaces. District Attorney Sarah Chun watched from the prosecution table, her stomach churning with anxiety as she observed the frightened child before her. Chun had prosecuted domestic violence cases for 15 years, but she had never encountered a situation quite like this one. Emma Rodriguez was their star witness, the only person who had seen Marcus Williams brutally assault her mother on that horrific February night. Without Emma's testimony, Williams would walk free, and Carmen Rodriguez would never find justice for the beating that had left her hospitalized for 2 weeks with a shattered jaw, 3 broken ribs, and internal bleeding. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. In the gallery sat Carmen Rodriguez, Emma's 26-year-old mother, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. Carmen's face still bore faint scars from that night. A thin line above her left eyebrow, where Williams had struck her with a ceramic plate, and a barely visible mark on her chin from when she had hit the kitchen floor. Her dark eyes never left her daughter's small figure, silently willing Emma to find her voice, to tell the truth that could set them both free from the nightmare that had consumed their lives. Behind Carmen sat her mother, Rosa Martinez, a woman who had immigrated to California 30 years earlier and worked double shifts at a textile factory to support her family. Rosa clutched a worn rosary in her weathered hands, whispering prayers in Spanish for her granddaughter's courage. Next to her were Carmen's 2 sisters, Maria and Sofia, both teachers who had taken time off work to support their family. The entire Rodriguez clan had rallied around Carmen and Emma, but they all knew that everything depended on what happened in this courtroom today. Child advocate specialist Maria Santos approached the witness stand with the gentle grace of someone who had spent years working with traumatized children. Santos was bilingual and had been specifically assigned to Emma's case because of her expertise in helping young victims navigate the legal system. She carried a small box of art supplies, crayons, coloring books, and a few stuffed animals, tools she had used successfully in dozens of similar cases. But Emma was different. Emma hadn't spoken a single word since the night of the attack 6 months ago. "Hello, Emma," Santos said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can you tell us your name, sweetheart?" She waited patiently, her kind brown eyes fixed on the child's face. Emma stared down at her small hands, her fingers gripping the armrests of the chair as if they were the only things keeping her anchored to reality. Her dark curls fell across her face like a curtain, hiding her expression from the packed courtroom. The Honorable Judge Robert Hayes, a veteran of the bench with 23 years of experience, watched the scene unfold with growing concern. Hayes had seen his share of difficult cases, but there was something particularly heartbreaking about this tiny witness. He had reviewed the case files extensively, studying the police reports, medical records, and photographs from the crime scene. The evidence was overwhelming. Williams had beaten Carmen Rodriguez with savage brutality, while 3-year-old Emma watched from her hiding place in the bedroom closet. Defense attorney Michael Torres sat at his table with an expression that barely concealed his satisfaction. Torres was known throughout the county as a skilled defender who specialized in domestic violence cases. He had built his reputation on finding technicalities and exploiting weaknesses in the prosecution's case. His client, Marcus Williams, was a 34-year-old construction worker with a history of violence and a physique that intimidated even seasoned police officers. Williams had been Carmen's boyfriend for only 8 months, but in that short time, he had turned their lives into a living hell. Torres knew that without Emma's testimony, the prosecution's case would collapse. The physical evidence was circumstantial at best. Williams claimed Carmen had fallen down the stairs after drinking too much wine. There were no other witnesses, and Carmen's own testimony, while powerful, might not be enough to convince a jury beyond reasonable doubt. Everything hinged on what a traumatized 3-year-old could or could not say. "Emma, can you point to your mommy?" Santos tried again, gesturing toward the gallery where Carmen sat. The little girl's eyes flickered briefly toward her mother, but no words came. The silence stretched like a taut wire, filled with the collective anxiety of everyone in the room. Court reporter Linda Kim sat poised at her machine, ready to transcribe whatever testimony might emerge, while the 12 jurors, a mix of parents, grandparents, and working professionals, watched with expressions of sympathy and frustration. Dr. Amanda Foster, the court-appointed child psychologist, observed from her seat near the witness stand, taking detailed notes about Emma's body language and behavior. Foster had interviewed Emma multiple times over the past 6 months, trying various therapeutic techniques to help the child process her trauma. Play therapy, art therapy, even hypnosis had failed to unlock Emma's voice. The little girl had simply retreated into herself, building walls that seemed impenetrable. 25 minutes had passed since Emma had been placed in the witness chair. Santos had tried coloring books, simple questions about colors and animals, even singing nursery rhymes. Nothing worked. Emma remained as silent as stone, her small body rigid with fear and trauma. The packed courtroom grew restless, sensing that they were witnessing a tragedy unfold in real time. Carmen Rodriguez finally broke down, her quiet sobs echoing through the silent courtroom as she realized her daughter might never find her voice again. The monster who had nearly destroyed their family was about to escape justice because of a 3-year-old's silence, a silence born from terror, so profound that it had stolen her very words. Judge Hayes rubbed his temples, feeling the crushing weight of an impossible decision approaching. Officer Jennifer Walsh had been standing at the back of courtroom 4B for the past 30 minutes, her heart breaking with each failed attempt to coax words from little Emma Rodriguez. Walsh was no ordinary court officer. She was a specialist in canine-assisted therapy, with 12 years of experience, helping traumatized victims find their voices. Her weathered hands, scarred from years of police work before transitioning to victim services, gripped the brass door handle as she watched the devastating scene unfold. At 43 years old, Walsh had seen enough human suffering to last several lifetimes. She had started her career as a patrol officer in Los Angeles, working the night shift in some of the city's most dangerous neighborhoods. After witnessing too many domestic violence cases where victims couldn't or wouldn't speak, she had pursued specialized training in victim advocacy. 3 years ago, she had discovered the revolutionary world of courthouse therapy dogs and had never looked back. "Your Honor, I have an unusual request," Walsh announced, her voice cutting through the heavy silence like a sword through silk. Every head in the packed courtroom turned toward her as she stepped forward, her black uniform pressed and professional, despite the emotional weight of the moment. Judge Hayes looked up from his notes, his tired eyes showing a flicker of curiosity, mixed with skepticism. Walsh's mind raced back to her first successful case with Rex, a 7-year-old boy named Tommy Chun, who had witnessed his father's murder in a convenience store robbery. Tommy hadn't spoken for 4 months until Rex entered the courtroom. The breakthrough had been so dramatic that it made local news and launched Walsh's career as a pioneer in courthouse canine therapy. "I'd like permission to bring in Rex, our certified courthouse therapy dog," Walsh continued, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. She had made this request dozens of times before, but never in such a high-profile case with so much media attention. The courtroom gallery was packed with reporters from the Los Angeles Times, local television stations, and even a correspondent from CNN who had been following domestic violence reform efforts across California. Defense attorney Michael Torres shot to his feet like a jack-in-the-box, his expensive Italian suit rustling as he moved. "Your Honor, this is preposterous," Torres exclaimed, his voice dripping with indignation. "We're talking about a murder trial here, not a circus. The defense objects in the strongest possible terms to this theatrical stunt." His face had turned red with anger, and small beads of perspiration appeared on his forehead, despite the courtroom's air conditioning. Torres had built his career on technical objections and procedural challenges. He was known throughout the legal community as Technicality Torres for his ability to get cases dismissed on the smallest infractions. At 51, he commanded fees of $800 per hour and had never lost a domestic violence case. His client, Marcus Williams, sat behind him with arms crossed, his massive frame filling the defendant's chair. Williams had the build of someone who worked construction for 15 years. Broad shoulders, thick forearms, and hands that looked like they could crush walnuts. Dr. Amanda Foster rose from her seat near the witness stand, her clipboard clutched against her chest. Foster was a clinical psychologist who specialized in childhood trauma and had testified as an expert witness in over 200 cases. Her gray hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her wire-rimmed glasses reflected the courtroom's fluorescent lights as she prepared to support Walsh's unprecedented request. "Your Honor, if I may," Foster began, her voice calm and authoritative. "I've been working with Officer Walsh and Rex for the past 2 years. The data is compelling. Rex has successfully helped 43 traumatized children provide testimony in cases where traditional methods failed." She opened her leather portfolio and pulled out a thick stack of documents. "I have statistical analysis showing an 87% success rate in cases involving nonverbal child witnesses." The courtroom erupted in whispers as reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. This was the kind of legal innovation that could make national headlines. In the gallery, Carmen Rodriguez looked up through her tears, hope flickering in her dark eyes for the first time in months. Her mother, Rosa Martinez, clutched her rosary tighter and whispered a prayer in Spanish. Judge Hayes studied the documents. Foster placed before him, his weathered face betraying nothing of his internal deliberation. At 62, Robert Hayes had presided over thousands of cases, from petty theft to capital murder. He had earned his law degree from UCLA at night while working full-time as a police dispatcher, and his 23 years on the bench had taught him that sometimes justice required unconventional methods. "Officer Walsh," Judge Hayes said finally, removing his reading glasses and fixing her with a penetrating stare. "Tell me about this dog's qualifications." Walsh straightened her shoulders, ready for the interrogation she knew was coming. She had faced skeptical judges before, and she had learned that facts and statistics were her best weapons. Rex is a 4-year-old golden retriever who completed 2 years of intensive training at the Canine Companions for Independence facility in Oceanside. Walsh began, her voice growing stronger with each word. "He's certified in trauma response, courtroom protocol, and child interaction therapy. He's undergone background checks, health screenings, and psychological evaluations more thorough than most human court employees." She paused, glancing at Emma, who sat motionless in the witness chair. "More importantly, Your Honor, he has a documented track record of helping children like Emma find their voices. Last month, he helped 8-year-old Maria Santos testify against her abusive stepfather. 3 weeks ago, he assisted 10-year-old David Kim in providing crucial testimony in a child endangerment case." Torres jumped up again, waving his arms dramatically. "Your Honor, we're setting a dangerous precedent here. What's next? Therapy ponies? Emotional support parrots? The courtroom is a place of law and order, not a petting zoo. His theatrical outrage was calculated to influence the jury, but several jurors were already looking toward Emma with expressions of sympathy. Judge Hayes held up his hand for silence, his decision weighing heavily on his shoulders. He looked at Emma, still frozen in terror, then at her mother's tear-streaked face, then at the packed courtroom full of people waiting for justice. "Bring in the dog," he declared firmly, his gavel hitting the bench with finality that echoed through the silent courtroom like thunder. The massive oak doors of courtroom 4B creaked open with a sound that seemed to echo through eternity, and every person in the packed chamber turned their heads in unison, like sunflowers following the morning light. The moment felt suspended in time, as if the universe itself had paused to witness what was about to unfold. Even the air conditioning system seemed to quiet its mechanical hum, creating a silence so profound that the soft padding of paws on marble could be heard with crystal clarity. Rex entered the courtroom with the dignity of a seasoned professional who understood the gravity of his mission. He was a magnificent golden retriever, 4 years old and weighing exactly 72 pounds of pure compassion wrapped in a coat that gleamed like spun gold under the courtroom's harsh fluorescent lights. His official therapy vest, a deep royal blue with silver lettering that read, "Courthouse Therapy Dog, do not pet while working," fit him perfectly across his broad chest and muscular shoulders. Officer Jennifer Walsh walked beside Rex with practiced grace, her hand resting lightly on the leather handle attached to his vest. She had trained for hundreds of hours for moments exactly like this one, but her heart still raced with anticipation. Walsh knew that the next few minutes could make legal history or end in devastating failure. There was no middle ground in cases like Emma Rodriguez's. Either Rex would work his magic, or a dangerous predator would walk free. Rex's brown eyes, warm and intelligent as melted chocolate, surveyed the tension-filled courtroom with the wisdom of an old soul. He had been carefully bred from champion bloodlines, specifically selected for their gentle temperaments and intuitive understanding of human emotion. His great-grandfather had been a legendary therapy dog who worked with veterans suffering from PTSD, and his bloodline carried an almost supernatural ability to sense trauma and respond with healing presence. Court reporter Linda Kim adjusted her stenotype machine with trembling fingers, knowing she was about to document something unprecedented in American legal history. At 58, Kim had transcribed everything from capital murder trials to celebrity divorces, but nothing had prepared her for the electric anticipation that filled the air. She positioned her fingers over the keys, ready to capture whatever miracle or disaster was about to unfold. The gallery buzzed with barely contained excitement as reporters leaned forward in their seats, their cameras and recording devices ready to capture every moment. Sarah Mitchell from Channel 7 News whispered urgently into her microphone, providing live commentary for viewers across Southern California. "We're witnessing something extraordinary here in Riverside County Superior Court," she breathed. "A therapy dog is about to attempt what seasoned prosecutors and child psychologists have failed to accomplish for 6 months." Even the most hardened criminals in the courtroom's public seating seemed mesmerized by Rex's presence. There was something about the dog that commanded respect, not through intimidation like Marcus Williams, but through an aura of pure, unconditional love that seemed to radiate from his very being. Convicted felons who hadn't shown emotion in years found themselves leaning forward, their faces softening as they watched Rex move with purposeful grace toward the witness stand. Judge Robert Hayes observed the scene with the keen eye of someone who had learned to read courtroom dynamics over 2 decades on the bench. He noticed how Rex's presence seemed to shift the entire energy of the room, from desperate anxiety to cautious hope. Even defense attorney Torres, who had been objecting vehemently just minutes earlier, found himself watching with grudging fascination as the golden dog approached the terrified child. Dr. Amanda Foster positioned herself strategically near the witness stand, her clipboard ready to document every nuance of Emma's reaction to Rex's presence. Foster had studied canine-assisted therapy extensively, but she had never witnessed it in such a high-stakes environment. Her professional reputation, built over 20 years of working with traumatized children, hung in the balance alongside Emma's testimony. Rex's training kicked in automatically as he approached the witness stand. He had been taught to read children's body language with scientific precision, the tilt of a head, the tension in tiny shoulders, the rapid breathing that signaled panic or fear. Emma Rodriguez exhibited all the classic signs of severe trauma. Rigid posture, downcast eyes, shallow breathing, and hands gripped so tightly to the chair arms that her knuckles had turned white. The dog's approach was choreographed like a ballet, each step calculated to avoid triggering Emma's fight or flight response. Rex had learned through extensive training that traumatized children needed to feel in control of their interactions. He couldn't rush toward them with typical golden retriever enthusiasm. Instead, he moved with the patience of a saint, allowing Emma to notice him at her own pace. Carmen Rodriguez sat in the gallery with her hands pressed against her mouth, afraid to breathe too loudly and disturb whatever magic might be about to happen. Her mother, Rosa Martinez, had stopped fingering her rosary and was instead making the sign of the cross repeatedly, her lips moving in silent prayer. Carmen's sisters, Maria and Sofia, flanked their mother like protective bookends, their own children at home with babysitters, so they could witness this crucial moment in their family's fight for justice. Marcus Williams shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his massive frame suddenly seeming less intimidating in the presence of Rex's gentle authority. Williams had built his life on fear and intimidation, using his physical presence to control and manipulate. But a therapy dog operated on entirely different principles: love, patience, and healing, concepts that were foreign to Williams's violent worldview. Rex paused about 6 feet from Emma's witness stand, his golden head tilted slightly as he studied the frightened child with infinite patience. His tail, usually a constant source of motion and joy, was still and controlled, signaling his professional mode. For the first time in 6 months, Emma Rodriguez slowly lifted her dark eyes from her lap. Their gazes met across the silent courtroom, and something electric passed between them, a connection that transcended species, language, and trauma. Rex's gentle brown eyes seemed to say what no human had been able to communicate. "You're safe now. I'm here to listen. You can trust me." The packed courtroom held its collective breath, sensing that they were witnessing the first spark of what might become a miracle. The moment Emma Rodriguez's dark eyes met Rex's gentle brown gaze, something shifted in the very fabric of the courtroom. It was as if a spell had been broken, or perhaps cast, a magic so subtle that it could only be felt, not seen. For 6 long months, Emma had lived trapped behind invisible walls of terror, her voice stolen by the brutality she had witnessed. But now, for the first time since that horrific February night, a tiny crack appeared in those impenetrable barriers. Emma's small body, which had been rigid with fear just moments before, began to relax almost imperceptibly. Her death grip on the witness chair's leather armrests loosened slightly, and her shallow, panicked breathing deepened into something approaching normal rhythm. Rex remained perfectly still, his golden form a statue of patience and understanding, allowing Emma to study him at her own pace, without any pressure or expectation. Officer Jennifer Walsh watched from her position near the witness stand, her trained eye catching every micro-expression that crossed Emma's face. Walsh had witnessed this phenomenon dozens of times before, but it never failed to amaze her. The moment when a traumatized child first recognized that Rex represented safety rather than threat. It was like watching a flower bloom in fast forward, petals of trust unfurling one by one. The courtroom had become a living, breathing entity, suspended in anticipation. Court reporter Linda Kim's fingers hovered motionless over her stenotag keys, afraid that even the soft clicking of the machine might shatter whatever delicate connection was forming between child and dog. In the gallery, Carmen Rodriguez had stopped breathing entirely, her hands pressed so tightly against her mouth that her wedding ring left indentations in her lower lip. Judge Robert Hayes found himself leaning forward unconsciously, his decades of judicial composure temporarily abandoned in favor of human curiosity and hope. He had presided over thousands of cases, but nothing in his extensive legal career had prepared him for the electric tension of this moment. Even defense attorney Torres had abandoned his theatrical objections, his calculating mind recognizing that he was witnessing something that could not be stopped by legal technicalities or courtroom procedures. Emma began to move with the careful deliberation of a wild animal approaching water, every muscle ready to flee at the first sign of danger, but driven by an instinctual need she couldn't quite understand. Her small patent leather shoes made tiny squeaking sounds against the witness chair as she shifted her position, preparing to climb down from the adult-sized seat that had made her feel so small and vulnerable. Rex's ears perked up slightly at the sound, but he remained in his professional position, neither advancing nor retreating. His extensive training had taught him to let traumatized children control the pace and distance of their interactions. Some children needed weeks to build trust. Others, like Emma, seemed to recognize something in his eyes that transcended their fear. As Emma's feet touched the cold marble floor of the courtroom, she seemed to shrink even smaller, her 3-year-old frame dwarfed by the imposing architecture of justice that surrounded her. The witness stand, jury box, judge's bench, and gallery. Seating all loomed above her, like the walls of a canyon. But Rex, lying calmly on the floor, had made himself her size. Approachable, non-threatening, and infinitely patient. Dr. Amanda Foster scribbled notes frantically, documenting every aspect of Emma's behavior for what she knew would become a landmark case study in trauma therapy. Foster had read about similar breakthroughs in her professional journals, but witnessing it firsthand was entirely different. The clinical descriptions of canine-facilitated emotional regulation and interspecies therapeutic bonding seemed inadequate to capture the profound humanity of what she was observing. Emma's approach was measured in inches rather than steps. Each movement forward required tremendous courage for a child whose world had been shattered by violence. Her tiny hand, pale and trembling, reached out toward Rex with the hesitant wonder of someone touching snow for the first time. When her fingers finally made contact with Rex's soft golden fur, the entire courtroom seemed to exhale collectively. "Nice doggy," Emma whispered, her voice so quiet that only Rex could hear the words clearly. But everyone in the packed courtroom saw her lips move, saw the first voluntary communication she had attempted in 6 months. The 2 words carried the weight of a symphony, the power of a thunderclap, the hope of resurrection. Rex's tail gave. The smallest, gentlest wag, not the exuberant full-body celebration typical of golden retrievers, but a controlled acknowledgement that he had heard and understood. His brown eyes never left Emma's face as she continued to pet his soft ears, her confidence growing with each passing second. Officer Walsh felt tears prick her eyes despite her professional training. She had seen Rex work his magic many times before, but Emma's case had haunted her for months. The little girl had been so deeply traumatized that several child psychologists had questioned whether she would ever speak again. Watching Emma's tentative smile appear as she stroked Rex's fur felt like witnessing a miracle. "The scary man hurt my mommy," Emma breathed into Rex's ear, her words barely audible, even in the pin-drop silence of the courtroom. But court reporter Kim's sensitive equipment caught every syllable, and her fingers flew across the keys, documenting the first breakthrough in a case that had seemed hopeless just minutes earlier. Carmen Rodriguez's tears flowed freely now, but they were tears of relief rather than despair. For 6 months, she had watched her vibrant, chattering daughter retreat into silent isolation. Carmen had feared that Marcus Williams had stolen not just her own voice through intimidation and violence, but had somehow murdered her daughter's spirit as well. Emma buried her small face in Rex's golden fur, drawing strength from his warmth and unconditional acceptance. He was really mean to Mommy, she continued, her voice growing slightly stronger as Rex's presence anchored her to safety. The words tumbled out like water, breaking through a dam, carrying with them months of suppressed terror and trauma. Judge Hayes signaled frantically to the court reporter, his heart pounding with the recognition that they were witnessing legal history in the making. After 6 months of silence, Emma Rodriguez was finally ready to tell her story, and Rex, a 4-legged angel in a therapy vest, had somehow unlocked the door to justice that everyone else had failed to open. With Rex's warm, reassuring presence anchoring her to safety, Emma Rodriguez found her voice in a way that defied every psychological theory and courtroom precedent. What had been locked away for 6 months behind walls of trauma suddenly began flowing like a river freed from winter ice. The transformation was so profound that Dr. Amanda Foster would later describe it in her case notes as the most dramatic therapeutic breakthrough I have witnessed in 23 years of clinical practice. Emma had climbed back into the witness chair, but this time she wasn't alone. Rex had positioned himself directly beside the chair, close enough that Emma could keep her small hand resting on his golden head while she spoke. Officer Jennifer Walsh had carefully adjusted Rex's position to ensure the court reporter could hear every word while maintaining the physical connection that gave Emma her newfound courage. The bad man threw plates at Mommy and made her fall. Down the big stairs, Emma began, her 3-year-old vocabulary struggling to convey the horror she had witnessed. Her voice, though still small and sometimes trembling, carried a clarity that stunned everyone in the packed courtroom. Rex remained absolutely motionless, his brown eyes fixed on Emma's face, providing the stable, non-judgmental audience she needed to finally release her burden. The courtroom listened in complete silence as Emma described February 14th, a Valentine's Day that had turned into a nightmare. Mommy was making dinner, and she was singing the pretty song she always sings, Emma continued, unconsciously, stroking Rex's soft ears as she spoke. Carmen Rodriguez recognized the song immediately, La Llorona, a traditional Mexican ballad that Carmen hummed while cooking. The detail was so specific, so authentic, that several jurors exchanged meaningful glances. District Attorney Sarah Chun felt her pulse quicken as Emma's testimony began filling in gaps that had puzzled investigators for months. The prosecution had struggled to establish a timeline of events, but Emma's childlike observations provided crucial details that no adult witness could have offered. The bad man came home, and he was walking funny, like Grandpa does when his hip hurts, Emma said, unknowingly describing Marcus Williams's intoxicated state that evening. Emma's description of hiding in her bedroom closet was heartbreaking in its innocence. I took Mr. Bunny with me because he was scared too, she explained, referring to the stuffed rabbit that investigators had found clutched in her arms when police arrived. We hid behind Mommy's dresses because they smell like flowers. The detail about Carmen's perfume was another small but significant corroboration. Crime scene photos had shown the closet exactly as Emma described, with several dresses pushed aside. Rex's presence seemed to create a protective bubble around Emma, allowing her to access memories that had been buried under layers of trauma. Child psychologists would later study this case extensively, marveling at how the dog's unconditional acceptance had somehow bypassed Emma's psychological defense mechanisms. I heard Mommy screaming, and then everything got quiet. Emma continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. That's when I got really scared. The jury of 12 ordinary citizens, teachers, shopkeepers, parents, and retirees, found themselves leaning forward unconsciously, hanging on every word from the tiny witness. Juror number 7, Patricia Wong, a retired elementary school teacher, wiped tears from her eyes as she listened to Emma's account. Wong would later tell reporters that she had taught thousands of children over her career, and she could recognize authentic truth when she heard it. Marcus Williams, the defendant, sat at the defense table with his massive arms crossed, but his intimidating presence seemed diminished in the face of Emma's growing confidence. Defense attorney Torres found himself in an impossible position. How could he cross-examine a 3-year-old who was speaking to a therapy dog? Every aggressive move he might make would only make him appear to be bullying a traumatized child. Emma's description of the kitchen violence was delivered with the matter-of-fact tone that children often use when describing traumatic events. He threw the white plates first, then the blue ones Grandma Rosa gave us, she said, providing another detail that matched the crime scene evidence perfectly. Mommy tried to run, but he caught her hair and pulled her back. Rex's steady breathing seemed to regulate Emma's own respiration, keeping her calm enough to continue. The medical evidence suddenly made perfect sense as Emma described her mother's fall down the stairs. He pushed Mommy really hard as she went bump, bump, bump down the big stairs, Emma said, unconsciously making a tumbling motion with her free hand while keeping the other firmly planted on Rex's head. Carmen Rodriguez's injuries, the broken ribs, internal bleeding, and head trauma, were entirely consistent with Emma's description of multiple impacts during the fall. Officer Walsh watched with professional fascination as Emma's testimony grew stronger and more detailed. The little girl who had been completely mute just an hour earlier was now providing a comprehensive eyewitness account that would have impressed seasoned detectives. Rex's training was working perfectly. His calm presence was allowing Emma to access traumatic memories without being re-traumatized by the telling. After Mommy stopped moving, the scary man looked up at the stairs and saw me, Emma continued, her voice growing smaller again as she reached the most terrifying part of her story. He pointed at me and said bad words, words that Mommy says I can't say. Emma's description of Williams's threats was chilling in its simplicity. He said, if I ever told anyone what happened, he would come back and hurt me really bad, like he hurt Mommy. The threat explained everything, why Emma had retreated into selective mutism, why she had been unable to sleep alone, why she had developed such severe anxiety that she couldn't attend preschool. Marcus Williams had deliberately terrorized a 3-year-old child to ensure her silence, counting on her fear to protect him from prosecution. Judge Hayes found himself gripping his gavel so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. In 23 years on the bench, he had heard thousands of testimonies, but Emma's words carried a weight that seemed to fill the courtroom with palpable truth. Rex had somehow unlocked not just Emma's voice, but the key to justice itself. Defense attorney Michael Torres found himself facing the most impossible challenge of his 30-year legal career as he stared across the courtroom at 3-year-old Emma Rodriguez, who continued to pet Rex while delivering testimony that was systematically dismantling his client's case. Torres had built his reputation on aggressive cross-examinations and technical objections, earning the nickname Technicality Torres for his ability to find procedural flaws that could free even the most obviously guilty defendants. But how? Does one attack the credibility of a traumatized toddler speaking to a therapy dog without appearing to be a monster? During the 15-minute recess Judge Hayes had called, Torres huddled with his client Marcus Williams in the small conference room adjacent to the courtroom. Williams was a mountain of a man, 6'3" tall, weighing 260 pounds of solid muscle built from 15 years of construction work. His massive hands, scarred from years of handling concrete and steel, clenched and unclenched as he paced the tiny room like a caged predator. "You need to destroy that kid's story," Williams growled, his voice carrying the same menacing tone he had used to terrorize Carmen and Emma Rodriguez for 8 months. "She's just a baby. She doesn't know what she saw. Make her look stupid, confused, unreliable." Williams's pale blue eyes, cold as winter ice, bore into Torres with an intensity that had intimidated countless victims into silence. But Torres was no victim, and he had dealt with violent clients before. At 51, he was a seasoned courtroom warrior who had faced down murderers, rapists, and armed robbers without flinching. However, Emma's testimony had shaken him in ways he wasn't prepared to acknowledge, even to himself. The little girl's innocent, detailed account had the ring of absolute truth, and Torres knew that attacking her would likely backfire spectacularly with the jury. "Marcus, listen to me carefully," Torres said, loosening his expensive silk tie as he prepared to deliver unwelcome news. "That child just provided the most compelling eyewitness testimony I've heard in 3 decades of practice. She described details that perfectly match the physical evidence, the medical reports, and the crime scene photos. If I go after her aggressively, the jury will crucify us both." Williams slammed his fist against the conference room wall, leaving a small dent in the drywall. "I'm paying you $800 an hour to win this case, not to tell me it's hopeless," he snarled. "Find something, anything, to discredit her testimony. She's 3 years old, for God's sake. How reliable can she be?" Torres understood Williams's desperation, but he also recognized a losing battle when he saw one. Emma's testimony had been devastating, not just for its content, but for its delivery. Speaking to Rex had somehow freed her from the paralyzing fear that had kept her silent for 6 months, and her words carried an authenticity that no coached witness could match. When court reconvened, Torres approached the witness stand with the careful deliberation of a man walking through a minefield. Every step had to be calculated, every question measured against the potential for catastrophic damage to his case. Emma sat in her oversized chair with Rex positioned protectively beside her, her small hand still resting on the dog's golden head like a talisman against fear. "Hello, Emma," Torres began, his voice artificially gentle in a way that fooled no one in the packed courtroom. "My name is Mr. Torres, and I just want to ask you a few questions, okay?" Emma nodded slightly, her dark eyes studying Torres with the wariness of a child who had learned that some adults couldn't be trusted. Torres decided to start with simple questions designed to test Emma's basic cognitive abilities and memory. If he could establish that she was confused about simple facts, he might be able to cast doubt on her more complex testimony. "Emma, can you tell me what color Rex is?" he asked, gesturing toward the therapy dog. "Golden, like sunshine," Emma replied without hesitation, her voice clear and confident. Rex's tail gave a small wag of approval, and several jurors smiled despite the serious nature of the proceedings. Torres made a note on his legal pad, already sensing that this line of questioning might not yield the results he needed. "That's very good, Emma," Torres continued, trying to maintain his gentle facade. "Can you count how many fingers I'm holding up?" He displayed 3 fingers, hoping to catch Emma in a moment of confusion or uncertainty. "3, like me," Emma announced, proudly, holding up 3 of her own tiny fingers in response. "I'm 3 years old." Her answer was so enthusiastic and accurate that several jurors exchanged glances, clearly impressed by the child's alertness and intelligence. Torres felt his strategy crumbling before his eyes. Emma wasn't the confused, unreliable witness he had hoped to present to the jury. Instead, she was demonstrating remarkable clarity and consistency, even under the stress of cross-examination. Rex's presence continued to provide her with the emotional support she needed to remain focused and truthful. Desperate to find some crack in Emma's testimony, Torres decided to test her memory of the night in question. "Emma, you said this happened on Valentine's Day. Do you know what month that is?" It was a reasonable question. Many 3-year-olds wouldn't understand the concept of months or dates. But Emma surprised everyone by answering with perfect accuracy. "February," she said simply. "Mommy told me it was the day when people give hearts and flowers. She was making special dinner because it was Valentine's Day." Once again, Emma had provided a detail that perfectly corroborated the prosecution's timeline. Torres glanced at the jury and saw 12 faces that had already made up their minds. Juror Patricia Wong, the retired teacher, was looking at him with barely concealed disgust, as if he were a bully picking on a defenseless child. Juror number 4, a father of 2 young daughters, had his arms crossed and his jaw set in a way that suggested he had no patience for anyone who would intimidate a traumatized toddler. In a moment of legal desperation, Torres decided to try one final gambit. He had Williams stand up, rising to his full 6'3" height, hoping that Emma might become frightened and confused when confronted with her alleged attacker. "Emma, do you see the man you were talking about in the courtroom today?" But Rex's presence had given Emma a courage that Marcus Williams's intimidation tactics could no longer break. She looked directly at Williams, her small chin lifting with defiance that seemed impossible for someone so young. "That's the mean man who hurt Mommy," she declared, pointing directly at Williams, without a trace of doubt or fear in her voice. The courtroom fell silent, as Emma's words hung in the air like an indictment from heaven itself. Dr. Amanda Foster approached the witness stand with the measured confidence of someone who had dedicated her entire career to understanding the complex relationship between trauma, healing, and the human psyche. At 47 years old, she was considered one of the nation's leading experts in pediatric trauma psychology, with 3 published books and over 100 peer-reviewed research papers to her credit. Her testimony would either validate the extraordinary breakthrough they had all witnessed, or provide the defense with ammunition to discredit Emma's remarkable recovery. Foster adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses and surveyed the packed courtroom, knowing that her words would likely influence not just this case, but the future of canine-assisted therapy in legal proceedings across the United States. She had testified as an expert witness in over 200 cases involving child trauma, but none had carried the potential for legal precedent that this moment represented. "Dr. Foster," began District Attorney Sarah Chun, "can you explain to the jury what we witnessed here today with Emma and Rex?" Chun's question was carefully crafted to establish the scientific foundation for what many observers might dismiss as simply a child's natural affinity for dogs. Foster turned toward the jury, her voice calm and authoritative, as she began to unravel the complex psychological mechanisms at work. "What we observed represents a well-documented phenomenon in trauma psychology called interspecies therapeutic bonding," she explained. "When humans, particularly children, experience severe psychological trauma, they often develop what we call selective trust impairment, an inability to feel safe enough with other humans to communicate effectively." Juror Patricia Wong, the retired elementary school teacher, leaned forward with obvious interest. Her 40 years in education had exposed her to countless traumatized children, but she had never seen anything quite like Emma's transformation. Foster continued, "Dogs, particularly therapy dogs like Rex, operate on entirely different psychological principles than humans. They offer what researchers call unconditional positive regard, without the complex social expectations that can overwhelm traumatized children." Rex, who had been resting quietly in the corner of the courtroom during Foster's testimony, seemed to understand that he was the subject of discussion. His golden ears perked up slightly, but he remained in his professional position, a living example of the discipline and training Foster was describing to the jury. Rex has undergone over 2,000 hours of specialized training, Foster explained, consulting her extensive notes. This includes trauma response protocols, stress recognition, emotional regulation techniques, and what we call therapeutic positioning, the ability to provide physical comfort without triggering defensive responses in traumatized individuals. She gestured toward Rex as she spoke, and several jurors found themselves looking at the therapy dog with new appreciation for his professional expertise. Foster's testimony grew more compelling as she presented statistical evidence of the therapy dog program success rate. In our 2-year study of courthouse therapy dogs across California, we documented an 87% success rate in cases where traditional therapeutic interventions had failed, she stated, holding up a thick bound report. That represents 43 children who found their voices through canine-assisted therapy, compared to only a 12% success rate using conventional methods alone. Defense attorney Torres rose for cross-examination with visible reluctance, knowing that attacking a respected psychologist's scientific testimony would be far more challenging than questioning a 3-year-old child. His strategy was to cast doubt on the reliability of testimony given under such unusual circumstances. But Foster was prepared for his assault on her professional credibility. Dr. Foster, Torres began, his voice carrying its usual courtroom authority. Isn't it possible that Emma's testimony was influenced by suggestion or coaching during her interaction with the therapy dog? How can we be certain that her words represent genuine memory rather than imaginative play? It was a sophisticated question designed to introduce reasonable doubt about the scientific validity of Emma's breakthrough. But Foster had anticipated this line of attack and was ready with compelling counterarguments. Mr. Torres, extensive research in developmental psychology shows that children Emma's age lack the cognitive sophistication to fabricate complex, detailed scenarios under stress, she replied firmly. The spontaneous, consistent, and emotionally appropriate nature of her testimony, combined with her physiological responses, normalized breathing, reduced cortisol indicators, improved eye contact, all confirm that we were witnessing authentic memory retrieval, not fantasy or suggestion. Torres pressed harder, knowing his client's freedom depended on discrediting Foster's scientific foundation. But Dr. Foster, you have no experience with therapy dogs yourself, correct? How can you speak with authority about a field in which you have no direct expertise? It was a calculated risk, but Torres hoped to portray Foster as an academic theorist, rather than a practical expert. The question backfired spectacularly. Foster's response revealed the depth of her preparation and expertise. Actually, Mr. Torres, I have been working directly with Officer Walsh and Rex for the past 2 years as part of a comprehensive research study funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, she replied with quiet confidence. I have personally observed and documented over 30 successful interventions, including detailed psychological evaluations before, during, and after each therapeutic session. My expertise in this area is based on direct clinical observation, not theoretical speculation. The defense's expert witness, Dr. Robert Manning, took the stand next in a desperate attempt to counter Foster's compelling testimony. Manning, a forensic psychologist with traditional views on courtroom procedures, argued that testimony given in such unusual circumstances couldn't meet normal standards of reliability. However, his credentials paled in comparison to Foster's specialized knowledge, and his lack of experience with therapy dogs became immediately apparent under cross-examination. Dr. Manning, Chun asked during her redirect, have you ever personally observed a canine-assisted therapy session? Manning was forced to admit that his entire critique was based on theoretical concerns rather than practical experience. Have you published any peer-reviewed research on trauma therapy in children? Again, Manning had to acknowledge that his expertise lay in forensic evaluation rather than therapeutic intervention. The contrast between the two experts was stark and obvious to the jury. Foster represented cutting-edge, evidence-based therapeutic innovation, while Manning embodied traditional skepticism without practical foundation. As Manning left the witness stand, several jurors were already shaking their heads in dismissal of his testimony. Judge Hayes called for a brief recess, but the jury's body language suggested they had heard enough scientific evidence to support their emotional conviction that Emma's testimony was genuine, reliable, and devastating to the defense's case. The jury deliberation room fell silent as Foreman Patricia Wong held the verdict form in her trembling hands, knowing that the words she was about to read would echo far beyond the walls of Riverside County Superior Court. The 12 jurors had deliberated for exactly 1 hour and 47 minutes, a remarkably short time for such a serious case. But Emma Rodriguez's testimony had left no room for doubt in their minds. Judge Robert Hayes surveyed the packed courtroom as the jury filed back into their seats, their faces revealing nothing of the momentous decision they had reached. The gallery was filled to capacity with reporters from across the nation, domestic violence advocates, legal scholars, and members of the Rodriguez family who had traveled from as far as Mexico to witness this historic moment. The case had attracted international attention, with legal experts calling it a potential watershed moment for trauma-informed justice. Marcus Williams sat at the defense table beside Michael Torres, his massive frame rigid with tension as he awaited his fate. For 8 months, he had terrorized Carmen and Emma Rodriguez through violence and intimidation, confident that a 3-year-old child could never testify against him. His pale blue eyes, which had once struck fear into his victims, now darted nervously around the courtroom like those of a cornered animal. Carmen Rodriguez occupied the front row of the gallery, flanked by her mother Rosa Martinez and her sisters, Maria and Sofia. Carmen's hands were clasped so tightly in prayer that her wedding ring had left deep impressions in her palms. For 6 months, she had watched her vibrant daughter retreat into traumatized silence, wondering if Emma would ever speak again. The miracle they had witnessed in this courtroom had given Carmen hope not just for justice, but for her daughter's complete emotional recovery. Rex lay quietly in his designated corner, his golden form a picture of professional calm despite the electric tension filling the air. Officer Jennifer Walsh sat nearby, her hand resting protectively on Rex's therapy vest. In the past 2 days, Rex had become a celebrity in his own right, with reporters dubbing him America's most important dog and child advocacy groups hailing him as a hero. But to Walsh, he was simply her partner in the sacred work of helping traumatized children find their voices. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Hayes asked, his voice carrying the weight of 23 years on the bench. He had presided over thousands of cases, but none had moved him quite like watching 3-year-old Emma Rodriguez find the courage to speak truth to power with a therapy dog as her anchor. "We have, Your Honor," Foreman Wong replied, rising to her feet with the dignity of someone who understood the historical significance of this moment. Wong, a retired elementary school teacher who had spent 40 years working with children, had been unanimously chosen by her fellow jurors to deliver their verdict. Her voice was steady and clear as she read from the official form. In the case of the people of California versus Marcus Allen Williams, on the count of domestic violence with great bodily injury, we find the defendant guilty. Williams's face drained of color as the first guilty verdict rang through the courtroom. Carmen Rodriguez covered her mouth with both hands, tears streaming down her cheeks as she heard the words she had prayed for during 6 months of sleepless nights. Wong continued with unwavering resolve. On the count of child endangerment, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of making terrorist threats, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of assault with a deadly weapon, we find the defendant guilty. Each guilty verdict landed like a hammer blow, systematically dismantling the reign of terror that Williams had imposed on the Rodriguez family. The courtroom erupted in restrained applause from the gallery, where domestic violence survivors and their advocates celebrated a victory that represented hope for countless other families trapped in cycles of abuse. Emma, who had been coloring quietly with Rex nearby during the verdict reading, looked up with curious eyes as she sensed the adults' emotional responses around her. Judge Hayes banged his gavel to restore order, then addressed Williams directly. "Mr. Williams, you have been found guilty on all counts. This court sentences you to 8 years in the California Department of Corrections, with the possibility of parole after serving a minimum of 6 years. Hayes paused, his eyes boring into Williams with judicial authority. "Additionally, this court issues a permanent restraining order, prohibiting you from any contact with Carmen Rodriguez or her daughter Emma for the remainder of your natural life." As bailiffs approached to escort Williams from the courtroom in handcuffs, he turned toward Carmen and Emma with one final attempt at intimidation. But Emma, emboldened by Rex's presence and the justice she had helped achieve, looked directly at her former tormentor without fear. "The bad man can't hurt us anymore," she announced in her clear, strong voice, causing several jurors to wipe tears from their eyes. The case's impact extended far beyond the courtroom walls. Within 6 months, the California state legislature had passed Emma's Law, mandating therapy dog programs in all family courts statewide. The legislation allocated $15 million annually for training therapy dogs and their handlers, with the program eventually expanding to all 50 states. Legal scholars would study the case for decades, citing it as a landmark example of trauma-informed justice and innovative therapeutic intervention. Emma's recovery exceeded everyone's most optimistic expectations. 6 months after the trial, she was attending preschool regularly, making friends, and chattering constantly about her adventures. Carmen Rodriguez had enrolled in college to become a social worker, inspired by her experience to help other domestic violence survivors navigate the legal system. She frequently spoke at conferences across the country, always crediting Rex with saving both their lives. Officer Walsh and Rex continued their sacred work, helping traumatized children find their voices in courtrooms across California. Their success rate climbed to 93%, with Rex becoming the most requested therapy dog in the state's judicial system. Walsh had written a book about their experiences, with all proceeds donated to domestic violence prevention programs. Emma still visited Rex monthly, bringing homemade cookies and endless hugs for the golden hero who had unlocked her voice and her future. During one such visit, she looked up at Officer Walsh with the wisdom of someone far beyond her years. "Rex didn't just help me talk," she said seriously. "He helped me be brave forever." In a world often filled with darkness and injustice, Emma Rodriguez and Rex had proven that sometimes heroes come with 4 legs, golden fur, and hearts capable of healing even the deepest wounds trauma can inflict.